Hello and welcome to Scientist Warning TV. And today I'm delighted to have with me Professor Adam Aron, who is a professor of psychology at University of California, San Diego. So welcome, Adam, and thank you for talking with me today.
Great to be here, Alison. Thanks so much.
So, Adam, I'd like to start with an article that came out towards the end of last year in Times Higher Education. And it was about something really bold and dramatic that you'd actually done. And the article was entitled, "How I Quit Neuroscience to Focus on Preventing Climate Breakdown." And in the article, which is really quite radical, it talks about the fact that you had been an eminent professor of neuroscience with masses of grants, publishing lots of articles and books and so forth. And then what you've done really very dramatically and very suddenly is just drop the neuroscience, and you've changed your career and you've changed your research direction to focus on research on the climate and ecological breakdown. So, firstly, what prompted you to do such a thing, which is in a sense almost a career killer?
Yes, well, I didn't drop the neuroscience all at once, but it was sort of in stages and then kind of quite definitively at the end. So I'd been worried about global heating for a long time. Then, I was a postdoc and I was busy having kids and doing my career. One of my kids was severely disabled. So I was very distracted for a long time. But I had this kind of worry about it all the time. And of course, it just obviously got worse and worse. And around 2016, I got involved with the fossil fuel divestment movement at the University of California, and I started doing stuff, and we got some wins later on. But I think even at that time, I didn't really understand how serious the predicament was, but I obviously knew something about it, and I wanted to help. And around 2018, I read that IPCC 1.5 Celsius report, and I was like, oh my God, like I had no idea this is so serious when I really took the time to actually, look at the data. And so then I asked my department chair, can I teach a class, Psychology of Climate Crisis? And bit by bit, I got more and more involved in the teaching and then forming being a co-founder of a grassroots group at the University of California and really becoming an activist and organizer, and just getting more and more involved and more knowledgeable and knowing people and knowing climate scientists, right? Knowing climate scientists and learning that a lot of this is an underestimate. Things are going more quickly. A lot of those IPCC pathways are kind of illusions, right? We're actually probably on RCP 8.5, the high emissions pathway. We may stay there if we don't cut dramatically. So my level of concern and engagement just went up and up. And I just found myself doing more and more of that and less of my neuroscience. And so it just got to the point where I'm like, I just need to spend more time on this. This is what I'm doing. This seems important. I have to try and make a difference. It's very alarming. It's very threatening to everything I hold dear. I can imagine the impacts on people in the global south, on the plants and animals. Something like 1/3 of plant and animals may go extinct by 2050 by some accounts if we carry on like this. So at some point, I was just like, I'm not going to do neuroscience anymore. And I kind of announced I'm returning my main grant to the NIH, and that caused quite a lot of consternation. But so I made that transition, and it was an anxious time for a while, but it feels like absolutely the right thing to do.
It's a momentous decision, as an academic myself, having done something fairly similar, because I just quit my job because that seemed to me the thing that I could do. But it's fascinating that that there are examples of people like yourself who really feel that the dissonance is just too much to bear, and that you have to do something. So you talked a little bit about what a reaction from your colleagues. So how have your colleagues and the students you teach, how have they reacted to this?
Well, let me think. So there's colleagues sort of the proximal ones in the department. There's the colleagues sort of around the wider university system, and then there's sort of the wider field, of neuroscience or cognitive psychology, cognitive neuroscience, which is what I was part of. I don't really, it's hard to know exactly what everyone thinks. I see the congratulations and well done and good for you and that's so courageous and yay. And there's quite a bit of that. Often I still get invited to review neuroscience articles, and I just reply and I send them the Times of Higher Education piece, which is why I quit neuroscience. And oftentimes, I would say half the time, they're like, "That's so great, good for you, good luck." And I'm getting that from associate professors and editors of journals. Within my department, it's been difficult, I would say. But there's definitely some supporters in there, and I think some of the younger professors are supportive. It has generated quite a lot of conflict. I mean, I'm basically, repudiating in a way what I was doing before, and I'm saying we need to shift and we need to change and we need to make the ecological and climate crisis part of our business and academic psychology, and that's not something everyone wants to hear. That is tantamount to sort of asking for some amount of redirection of attention in the department, which is of course what we need. So there's some pushback on that. Grad students are much more supportive, and there's something like, I don't know, fully 10 to 30% of them probably are supportive, and some of them are collaborating with me and talk to me about it and wish they could find a way to do something like that. In the wider university, I think there's lots of supporters really. So it's not been terrible, but it is difficult. And I sort of lost my entire cognitive neuroscience community in one fell swoop. Boom. It's not like people hate me or dislike me, but it's like I'm not relevant to them anymore. Boom, just gone. On the other hand, I'm building up a new community. I'm connected with you, Alison, and I'm connected with people dotted around the world who are typically social scientists. I'm trying to kind of reach out to a lot more social scientists who really care about this issue and figure out how to kind of move forward. So it's sort of a recentering away of my colleagues are less my immediate academic department and more this kind of far-flung network now of intellectual minds who are trying to find their way as well.
I mean, that's fascinating because, on the one hand, you talk about your personal need to do something like this. And of course, one of the responses perhaps is that in so doing, you're in a sense rejecting, you're sort of undermining the validity of the work that you're doing and saying, no, actually, this is much more important, which puts people in a very, very difficult position.
I think that's right. I think that's right. I got invited recently to actually do a talk to the department at the retreat, which was kind of a big deal for me. It was quite stressful because I've been so sort of marginalized for years now. And so I gave this talk and, people are kind of stunned, right? I'm sort of talking about tipping points and how dramatic this is and how serious it is and how we have to confront political power and fossil fuel industry, including in the university system. And, so it went down quite well. And then the next talk was someone talking about, the mouse brain or something. I don't know. How does that person feel now? Because he knows that the biosphere is under threat, and he has to go on, right? So I think it is a kind of tough thing for other people to deal with. That there's a sort of insurgent. It's almost like an insurgent in the midst, and someone sort of saying, "For God's sake, open your eyes." There's a kind of broad denial. It's not the denial of science. It's not the denial of the human cause. It's not a denial of the impacts, but it is a kind of denial that this is my business, that this is my responsibility. I can't look at this too much. I need to carry on doing my normal thing. And I think people are struggling with that.
Exactly. It's a combination of things. It isn't just denial, but there's an element of disavowal in there, I think, as well. I think there's probably an element of fear, from my own experience when I would go in and talk about papers, and then it was, well, that's very interesting, but let's get back to the agenda. Which brings me on to my next question, and you've already sort of talked a little bit about this, but it's something about the barriers and obstacles that you faced in orienting your career in this way, which is important because someone like you is a role model. You're an example of the kinds of questions that academics should be asking of themselves, and you've responded to that challenge by doing something really radical. Which has presumably eased the dissonance that you experience yourself. Obviously, you've faced some difficulties. So for someone watching this who might be thinking, crikey, I really have to think about why I'm doing, research on mechanical engineering, for example. Should I be doing something to help? So what kinds of barriers and obstacles have you yourself faced? And what would you say to someone who's thinking, yeah, I really need to do something?
Well, those are sort of, let me think. It's two things: the barriers I've faced, and so I'm going to try and separate those questions. Sorry, Alison.
That's fine.
So, I mean, first of all, my view is, I mean, from an individual point of view, I wouldn't expect everyone to kind of do something as dramatic as what I did. Partly I was in a psychology department, and so it was possible for me to stop doing one kind of psychology, which was the psychology of the the brain mind, as it were, cognitive neuroscience, and sort of shift now and say, no, I'm going to now do the psychology of collective action on the climate crisis. I was able to kind of stay in my department and in my broader field. And so not everyone is in that situation. And secondly, I mean, I think there are lots of reasons why people keep doing what they're doing and should keep doing what they're doing. Some people really love it. I mean, we want people to keep studying Renaissance literature, no matter what happens, right? We need the best in humanity to flourish. Science is a beautiful enterprise. Some people are just doing very basic science questions that who knows whether they're interesting or who knows if they're important. They're interesting and fascinating to that person. They love it, and that's a very good thing. We want that to go on. I want that to go on. So it's not as if you want everyone now to kind of jump on making their research relevant to the climate crisis. I do think, though, that everyone should be engaged at some level as an advocate. I mean, if you're going to do your basic, your pure mathematics by day, you can definitely be an advocate by night, right? And we need a lot more people to be advocates at many stages of society. And obviously that's not the case. But then there's people, obviously, in biology, in almost every discipline you can think of. Maybe pure mathematics is one where it's not the case. But every area of anthropology, sociology, most areas of engineering, many parts of biology, like plant biology, for example, everything like that, those sorts of things, just most disciplines, it's absolutely pertinent, right? You could probably change your direction by 20 degrees. I mean, plant biologists could study soil sequestration. Engineers could repurpose somewhat more to sort of the materials of the renewable energy transition. Sociologists could shift a bit and focus more on collective action and movement building. I mean, so I think it's not that hard for everybody, right? Depending what you're doing and where you are. Some of the historians are jumping in and teaching the Anthropocene now quite easily. I just learned from a friend of mine in Cambridge University that she's creating a new class now on the Anthropocene, right, in history. And that's exciting. I'm like, that's great. The students are going to love it. I think quite a lot of academics could shift their teaching and to some extent their research actually without too much trouble. But it sort of depends who you are and where you're situated. And then some might do something as dramatic as I've done and altogether change direction. The barriers that I have right now are really, or along the way and right now are really, I guess there's two main barriers. One is I have to kind of figure out, so in my typical career, I love doing cognitive neuroscience. I love the process of coming up with experiments with students and others and kind of having that kind of exciting vision, like, oh my God, what if it would be like that? And let's design this experiment. And then, months and years go by and we get the results and writing it up and pushing it out. And, part of that whole process is fun. Part of it is a bit egotistical, right? It's like, oh, I've got another paper now. Maybe I'll get in a really good journal and people will notice. And part of it is like, you keep doing that thing because you've got grants and that's the kind of machine. You're kind of on this thing. And so now I'm at the stage where I really ask questions now about like, why would this research even be worthwhile from the beginning? Like, I don't feel as if I need to have another paper, to advance myself, another paper. So if I'm going to do social science research that's relevant to the climate crisis, what is that research? So the barrier I face right now is really coming up with the kind of research program that's actually worthwhile, I think, in the time we have left to actually make a difference, which is really a high bar. And so that is, methodologically, philosophically, practically, finding collaborators, finding people to talk to, finding people to brainstorm with about the sort of very practically oriented research I want to do, but nevertheless, that must have some kind of theoretical component. So that's a barrier. It's like how to make my way in this new field. The second barrier is, I suppose, funding. I knew how to secure funding for cognitive neuroscience. I knew how to write grants for the NIH. I knew when the proposal deadlines were. It was a standard procedure. Sometimes you'd win, sometimes you wouldn't. But it was very clear what I needed to do. This is really unclear, right? And I think, in my wider field of psychology, there's definitely funding, but the kind of funding is changed to things like individual consumption. It's not connected with collective action. In fact, governments like, and government agencies like NSF and NIH in the United States are not going to fund grants that are talking about challenging power structures. The one thing that really matters, which is to figure out, or one of the things that really matters to me, which is to figure out how to get a broader social mobilization. Even in California, we have incredible legislation lined up, some incredible legislation. A lot of it is being blocked by fossil interests. And if more people were mobilized and understood and could connect, we'd get that stuff through, and we'd enhance this transition. Well, I think we need a kind of social science research on how to achieve that social mobilization, but ultimately that is about challenging power structures. And so standard funding bodies are not going to be interested in that. So, okay, so now where are you going to get your funding from? And there definitely are private foundations. There's all sorts of pots of money around it. But like, how do you navigate that space? That is a real barrier for me, because I don't know how to do that.
Yeah, you've said so many interesting things there, and I think you're up against it because you're isolated there. There aren't a great many people around you. You haven't got the support structures, and you haven't yet got a big enough network. And the networks that do exist at the moment aren't sufficiently powerful to make their voices heard. Kind of brings me to the next question that I want to talk with you about, which is, yes, it can be argued that governments have failed. I spoke with Bill McGuire the other day, and we talked about the chances of actually limiting warming to the 1.5 degree Paris goal. But arguably you could say, yes, governments have failed, but there's also a sense in which academia as an enterprise has failed too, because academic institutions that generate all this amazing research that you've talked about should be at the vanguard of change, and that should be there driving this much needed radical transformation. And they're not. They're not there. Articles are starting to be written about this, and people are starting to ask those questions about, what is the role of academia in this future? What's happened to the science society contract? So what do you think's gone wrong for academia? It's, in a sense, it's lost the agenda, and it's lost its voice.
I think there's a few things. It's a big question, Alison. I haven't thought about it a whole lot, but there's a few things. First of all, obviously we've got mRNA vaccines, and we wouldn't have mRNA vaccines, which have been a huge boon to humanity, if someone hadn't done the basic science, and some of that was done in universities and were done with public money. And we wouldn't have MRI machines if physicists hadn't figured out basic stuff about nuclear magnetic resonance a long time ago, because they were fascinated by it. So there's a lot of basic science and curiosity-driven research being done in universities that's just fantastic, and of course we should have that. And so in that sense, they're not failing. And there's just amazing, like University of California is an astonishing place, as you can imagine. So, but if we think about the predicament we face, which is, global heating probably, on this pathway we're on, we may hit 1.5 Celsius as soon as 2030, right? Or 2032 is the median for the medium emissions pathway. We are, as we know, increasing the probability of reaching tipping points, and massive permafrost thaw, collapse of the Amazon, the lungs of the planet, etc. Like, a lot of that stuff may not matter in a few decades. So in a deeper sense, the universities, I think, are failing society because they are not generally orienting to this in the dramatic and radical way they should be to get the broader social mobilization. So there's no question in University of California. The state has now allocated $100 million. There's $100 million of new research money coming to University of California. Climate. But that's all resilience and adaptation. And the normal players who for decades have done, the stuff they've done are just going to get more of it. The various research groups that are climate groups are like, more money for our labs. Is that money, is that research going to be directed towards mitigation? No, for the most part, no. Obviously, some of it becomes technology like better batteries, and some of it's important, like we need crops that are more resistant. But generally speaking, it's kind of what I spoke about before. This is about power. This is about confronting power structures. This is about the fact that in the state of California, for example, there is an incredible tussle going on now. The governor has on one side these fossil interests and private utility companies and the oil companies, everything associated with that, sort of pulling down the seesaw and got him by the throat and got a lot of the damn politicians by the throat. And on the other side of the seesaw are the environmental and climate justice advocates and the people. And what we need is like that thing to go like that, and then everything goes much more quickly. But that process of how do we get that broader mobilization is not something people are going to study in universities. It's not something that the state is going to support. I think that is the sense in which universities are failing. I don't see, or at least I should speak about my university, I don't see academics jumping into advocacy, really standing up, really pushing for that kind of research that is about challenging the power structures. And one of the reasons I know that is because very few of them are willing to challenge their own institution. The University of California emits 1 million tons of carbon dioxide per year from burning fossil gas in power plants on campuses. The University of California is using Chase Bank, Wells Fargo and Bank of America, sort of 3 and 4 in the list of the worst finances of fossil extraction, to this day, with an operating budget of about $40 billion per year. And very few people seem concerned about that. It's just like, what is this? How are we going to get off fossil fuels and confront fossil finance if the academics themselves in the institution they're in aren't particularly concerned about that? And so in that sense, I feel like the universities are failing. They're failing in the sense that they are not engaged enough in the advocacy struggle. They're not engaged enough in even changing themselves to get off fossil fuels. And they're not engaged enough in orienting their brilliant faculty to deal with this wider social mobilization.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, of course, that's what they should be doing. They should be confronting power, and it should be part of the brief of an academic to not just understand your disciplinary area, but also to understand your obligations and responsibilities to the young people that you are teaching, who will become citizens of the future, planetary stewards. Call it what you will. And I wonder if when you say people don't seem to be particularly interested in the numerous ways in which fossil fuel interests infiltrate academia, it could also be that they just haven't really appraised themselves of this, that they simply, there's a knowledge deficit. Which of course would speak to the requirement and the responsibility academics have to become acquainted with those sorts of things and those aspects of the running of their university beyond just what's in their disciplinary silo. I thought it'd be good to sort of end on a more positive note, because obviously you're involved in a lot of campaigns. You've become a quite prominent activist. You've been involved in conversations with activist groups like Scientists Rebellion, global group across based in the UK. So could you say something about some of the campaigns that you're involved in and success stories and what's actually been working? What actually works?
Yes. So I have been involved in really being an activist and organizer at the University of California way back to sort of 2016, but particularly 2019, which is when we really formed this grassroots organization called the Green New Deal at UC San Diego. And so we have kind of allies across the other 9 UC campuses, because there's 10 campuses in this overall system. So yeah, we've accomplished amazing things, right? So I feel very good about it, and in general, and proud of what we've done. And it is, just to give a few examples, I mean, just to understand, right, that we are at our core are typically, I would say, 15 to 20 people. There's a sort of periphery maybe of 30, 40 supporters, and there's some, for example, faculty allies and various other people in other situations who support us but aren't really part of our group. But 15 to 20 core members over about a 3-year period, constantly sort of changing. Some of the faculty, like me, are kind of constant there, but students come and go. And this little band has, really been responsible for reorienting the entire University of California system, all 10 campuses, to basically recognize that their climate action plan was bullshit. It was basically carbon offsets. Mm-hmm. And the 10 campuses are now engaged in a concerted effort to plan for a full-scale electrification of their power generation. The chancellor announced this week that climate change is now the number 2 priority. They formed a fossil-free pathways task force. Berkeley has actually made plans, partly at our instigation, and secured $300 million from the state to literally take down its cogeneration plant. We've achieved $900 million of literal sale of stocks and bonds by University of California from fossil-owning companies, partly because of the whole divestment campaign. We've kicked Chase Bank out of UCSD as a retail bank, not only through our efforts, but in alliance with other interests. And we've secured now a commitment from University of California, San Diego for 30,000 undergrads to have a general ed requirement on climate. Right now, it's going to be implemented within a year. So this kind of clamoring, our campaigns, our relentless standing on the side of the road with big banners, our social media campaigns, our rallies, our protests, our huge emailing campaigns, our petitions, absolutely avid and strong graduate student supporters of our org, getting into meetings with the higher ups repeatedly over and over again, getting in front of the regents. All of this has actually added to some change. So it's extremely gratifying and important to recognize, as Margaret Mead said, all you need is a small group of determined people. We don't need everybody, Alison, to be in the struggle. We need a very small, a fraction of a percent to actually be really organizing and activists, but we need a lot more to be advocates and supporters in various kinds of ways. So, I mean, I honestly look at this whole thing and I'm very encouraged, and I really believe that the only way we'll really, have some probability of success in our global predicament, at least in, thinking about these global north countries that I'm in, is we need an upscaling of activism and organizing with a lot of advocacy attached to it to really just push in every space, every mayor, every regional, every head of states in California, heads of national governments just need to be impelled and pushed by enough well-placed, well-orchestrated efforts, and all of this is going to start adding up. So that's the way to go.
It's encouraging, and it just underscores the point that activism works. That we really need activism. I mean, you're right.
It does, yeah.
We do need more people to advocate. And it's also true that, and it's been said by other scientists as well, that not every academic could be an activist. They couldn't do it as well as clearly you do. But everyone can up their game. Everyone can step into that space a little.
Everyone can, I think it's important to make the distinction between activism and advocacy. I don't, activism jumps to mind. It has some connotations. It's sort of, standing on the street corner screaming about climate justice, which isn't something everyone wants to do. Even most students don't want to do that. They don't want to go to rallies and they don't want to shout. And so we don't need a lot of people to be doing that. The activist organizers can be a tiny fraction, but they create the organizations, the spaces, the campaigns. The governor signed a bill last week that went through the legislature that was sort of 10 years of organizing by environmental justice groups in California to get setbacks, which means the oil and gas drilling has to be at least 3,200 feet away from, schools, right? And, that kind of campaign is put together by a tiny number of people, activists, organizers, but ultimately, as it moves through the legislature, you need a lot more people in the state to mobilize behind. And I think that academics could be like that too. I think one shouldn't expect most to be activists, but they need to be made cognizant of or connected with the campaigns in the university and in the state. And their voices need to be added at the right time in the right way. And many of them have policy and other kinds of expertise that could be important. So I think that's one of our challenges, to bring in more advocates.
That's a good point. It's good. And it's great to end on such a positive note as well, and to hear your account of some campaigns that you're involved in that, as you say, don't involve a huge number of people, but they're being effective, because we need to feel that there is some hope. And to know that some things actually work. So thank you, Adam, for your time. It's been great to talk with you.
Thanks, Alison.